Hey guys, it's Miss Vinian here with Progressive Error Part 1 video. If you look at your screen, you have a new unit learning target sheet, and this will have two essential questions. We are on the first essential question, and how did progressives try to change life in the U.S. in the late 1800s and the early 1900s? If you scroll, today we're going to be looking at learning targets 2.2, describe working conditions in the industries, and 2.4. Discuss the major goals of the progressives and the muckrakers. Okay, so if you want to go ahead and put those down, dates covered, and this should actually say examples, so you can just list examples after you're done there, and that will help. Okay, and a quick reminder that we're going to have vocab quizzes. If you're A-Day, the first one is Wednesday, September 30th, B-Day is Thursday, October 1st. Test 1 will cover these words right here, and they're on Quizlet. And then also you have your homework for the whole unit listed. Awesome! Let's get started. Okay, so we are moving from Gilded Age to Progressive Era, and Progressive Era is from the late 1800s to about 1920, but we call those dates sometimes just 1900 through 1916. And the whole point of this is for society to fix what happened in the Gilded Age. Okay, so if you're wondering progressive, think of progress. Okay, so they want to expose the ills of society. We say ills as in, you know, the bad parts of society. And three of those are urbanization, social disorder, and political corruption. All things that we discussed in the last unit. Okay, so how are they going to fix this? They're going to write new laws to correct social problems. They're going to come up with some new ideas based on populism, which we will cover, and the goals of the labor movement. We have not covered the labor movement yet, but we will get to that today. The government can be an instrument of social change is kind of like the new idea. Before, it was very every man for himself. And now people are seeing that the government has something that they can do about this. They're the government. So let's make some laws. Alright, so goals of the progressives. You got four major goals. Number 1, end laissez-faire. Remember, laissez-faire means hands-off government, hands-off economics. Number 2, end abuses of monopolistic power with antitrust legislation. We've already covered the Sherman Antitrust Act. Number 3, make the government more responsive. Okay, that means that the government can improve society, not make it worse. And number 4, limit the power of party bosses and government abuses of power. Those are the four goals of the progressive era. You're going to make sure that you know that. And as you can see at the bottom, it says learning target 2.4, so you know which learning target it is. Okay? So, how do we do that? We do that through, firstly, muckrakers. Muckrakers are the journalistic voice of progressives. They are the people who speak out about what's happening in society. And they're mainly investigative journalists. So they're the ones, you know, that go into factories and expose things. They go into, you know, places where political machines are running in communities, and they expose them. They expose corruption and other problems. So basically, it's very profitable. You have these cheap magazines, and some of these magazines are still around today. People would buy these magazines just so that they could read about this, corruption. Okay, so on the front cover it'd be like, corruption in the meatpacking industry, and people would buy it. So it was actually a really good way to make money for magazines. It's still a good way today. When someone is exposed on the internet or in a magazine, everybody goes and buys that magazine. So some of the famous ones in our class activity is going to focus around these three. Upton Sinclair, he wrote the book The Jungle, which is about the meatpacking industry, and be ready to barf when you hear all the disgustingness that happened in the meatpacking industry. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, and so he would go into tenements, which are the crowded apartment buildings we talked about last unit, and take pictures. And then Ida Tarbell, who was very brave, and she brought down, she really hated Rockefeller, and she really exposed Rockefeller in the history of the Standard Oil Company. So we'll talk about those during class. So just for one example, Upton Sinclair is actually a socialist, and a socialist tends to believe more that the government should be more involved and the government should support society, as opposed to a capitalist who's going to believe more in private, you know, privately owned property and every man for himself, which is what we've sort of discussed already. So really what Upton Sinclair wanted to do was like expose what it was like to work in a factory. But what he found out when he went into these factories is that the food they're making is disgusting, and there's rats in it, and there's, you know, people who've fallen in and they're dead and they've been grounded up in the meat. So he's just one really good example of a muckraker, because he wants to demands that the government get rid of capitalism, because capitalism, the only reason these things are happening, he says, is because these men who built America, these big bosses who have a lot of power, aren't doing anything to help their workers, and they're not protecting their workers. So he demands socialism because he wants workers to control. He wants the people to control, not the rich people. Okay, he wants the middle class to control what's happening. All right, that is you can go ahead and read that if you want to pause it. It's disgusting. We're going to read this in class, though, but it's talking about rats in the meat. So, bleh, gross. Okay. So how did they change these things? What were their methods to helping solve America's problems? The first thing is they're going to rely on scientific data, which is not something they've done before. They're actually going to do research and look at the data and see what does the data show so that we can change these things and make them better for America. They're going to ask experts. They are going to use the muckrakers, and basically muckrakers are going to put pressure on legislators to pass laws so that that people are safer, and they have better working conditions, better sanitary conditions. And the funny thing about muckrakers is that the term comes from Teddy Roosevelt, who basically said that a muckraker is someone who literally rakes muck, and we all know muck is mud. So basically these muckrakers are going in and they are literally like raking the bottom of the barrel of the mud and exposing this disgusting filth that is America. So when we talked about the Gilded Age, the muckrakers are exposing the inner part of the gilded whatever it is that is disgusting. Okay, so the muckraker means investigative journalist, but the term comes from Roosevelt saying that about muckrakers. Okay. One thing I want to point out here is that members of both political parties, both Democrat and Republican, were progressives, and they were wanting to change these things. The only people that aren't on board with the progressives are the people who have a lot of the power and a lot of the money. Okay. So this brings us to child labor. So this is going to go to Learning Target 2.2. During this time, child labor is at an all-time high. You have 9 to 10-year-olds. They're called breaker boys. So they would go in and they would like chip out in the coal mines, the coal, and they were paid 60 cents a day. But they would get so sick and their lungs would be full of dust, and their hands are permanently crippled. Some kids worked up starting at the age of 5. So they're forced to work. They have to help their family. And the other thing is children can get in areas that adults couldn't. So the children could climb behind machines when they're broken and fix them. But legislation is going to be pushed through during this time period that's going to set a minimum age for employment and maximum hours worked for child labor. So the very first success in labor laws is going to be for child labor. So all of you who are 15, 16, or 17, you can thank the child labor laws of the Progressive era. Okay, so what are they going to do about all of these problems in the factories? So we have what we call the rise of labor unions, okay? So, and you've probably heard of labor unions before. A labor union is basically strength in numbers. There's a teacher labor union, there's a firefighter labor union, basically any professional job there's a labor union. Basically the labor union protects the people. So if you don't know what a labor union is, write that down. Strength in numbers protects the people. It's working for the people. Okay, so they attempt to gain better working conditions and pay for those that are in factories. And we're just going to go over some of the famous ones. One of the most famous ones during this time was called the Knights of Labor. This is a pretty cool labor union because it's ahead of its time. They're the first to accept workers of all races and all genders. So you could be black, white, Asian, you can be male, you can be female at a time where females were heavily discriminated against, and they are going to push for 8-hour workday, equal pay for women, and a cool thing about them is they accepted skilled and unskilled laborers, which we discussed when we talked about new immigrants and old immigrants, and how new immigrants were unskilled, so many of them worked in factories, and old immigrants were skilled, so they had professions such as blacksmith, locksmith, those types of things. And so Knights of Labor will protect both, whereas some labor unions will discriminate against people. Okay, so another one of those, speak of the devil, the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, was started by a guy named Samuel Gompers, and we'll cover him a little bit more when we get into, we're going to talk about primary sources of labor unions. The AFL accepted only skilled white males. They got higher wages and shorter work weeks for its members, but guys, skilled white males are going to be like the most privileged class in America during that time, and still today. So it was easier for them to get higher wages and shorter work weeks. It was good, however, for the rise of labor unions because it shows that labor unions can make a difference. Another one was the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, or called the Wobblies. It was created in 1905, and this is mainly for unskilled workers who believe in socialism. Okay, and if you're still confused on socialism from when we talked about it a little while ago, we have talked about capitalism and communism. Socialism falls in the middle of capitalism and communism. It's an economic philosophy that favors public control of property and income. Okay, so these people were socialists that were in the IWW, and they're unskilled workers. Okay, so some setbacks. So you had this really great rise of labor unions that's really going to help the 8-hour workday. It's going to help, you know, working conditions, sanitary conditions. It's going to help all of these things, minimum wage. So there's a couple of things, though. In a labor union, they would go and they would speak to the boss, and basically if you're in a labor union, they petitioned for the right to strike. So this is the time period of strikes. Okay, and if you're a worker going on strike, you are saying, hey, this is what I want you to pay attention, and you need to give us what you want. That's where the strength in numbers comes from. So one of those is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. The railroad workers, they strike to protest wage cuts, and they go on strike, and the company does nothing. Okay, and this is the Pullman Company, which we'll talk about in class. The Pullman Company made sleeping trains where you can sleep on them, overnight trains. So violence erupted in many cities over a week. So this was a widespread strike, and violence was widespread, and the workers actually like tore up the tracks. They would go and they would tear them up. All this work they had done building the railroads, and then they went and tore it up so that none of the railroads could operate. And then this is also the time where you have the word scab come into place, and that is where a boss, when their workers are on strike, will hire a scab. That's a worker called in by the employer to replace strikers. And if you are a striker, you do not like a scab. Okay, but a lot of times scabs were just people who needed money. So during this time, the courts, this is still during the Gilded Age. If you look at the dates, 1877, the courts still, they side with the business during the Gilded Age. If you remember, we talked about the Pendleton Civil Service Act that ended federal government giving money to politicians. Now the corporations